I also hope that you are having an amazing day so far. All right, so today we will be doing our grade 8 English lesson on direct and indirect objects. So we'll be doing our grade 8 English lesson on direct and indirect objects. And before we start, we're going to log into aplusstudents.ca. So we're going to log into aplusstudents.ca. And you're going to log in with your username as well as your password. Once you've logged in with your username as well as your password, and then you're going to select the subject of language arts. And then we choose grade 8. All right, so once you have selected grade 8, and then you're going to scroll down up until you get to the chapter of direct and indirect objects. All right, so now when it comes to the chapter of direct and indirect objects, the lesson under the chapter of direct and indirect objects, we are going to focus on, is it a direct object or an indirect object? So is it a direct object or an indirect object? So our chapter is direct and indirect objects. And under our chapter, the lesson we are going to focus on is it a direct object or an indirect object? And we are going to find out now what is a direct object and what is an indirect object. So basically, a direct object, right, is the pronoun. It is a noun or noun phrase that receives the action. So direct object is the pronoun, right? Or the noun phrase that receives the action of a verb. And remember, the verb is something that you do, it's the action. Which means that if we are saying that the pronoun, noun, or noun phrase that receives this action, it's the same as like saying it's either a person, a thing, an animal, or somebody that, or something that receives this action. And to find the direct object, right, in a sentence, we need to locate the action verb. And then we need to ask what or whom it is acting on. So basically, a direct object is an object in which the verb is acting on. For example, he sold his car. So car is a direct object. So he sold his car, and car is the direct object. So direct object is the object in which the verb is acting on. And in this sentence, he sold his car. What did he sell? He sold his car. So car is a direct object. It's something that they are acting on. So now an indirect object, right, is the recipient of the direct object. For example, the man gave his wife a necklace. So which means that necklace is the direct object and wife is the indirect object. So basically a direct object it is which the verb is acting on. So the pronoun or the noun or even the noun phrase, they receive this action of a verb. And we need to ask ourselves, what or whom is it acting on? All right. So basically, our lesson that we are going to be doing is on aplusstudents.ca, right? So we've logged on to aplusstudents.ca already. So we're going to go to aplusstudents.ca. So once again, a direct object is the pronoun. It is the noun or noun phrase that receives the action of a verb. And to find the direct object in a sentence, we need to locate the action. We need to find the action verb and ask what or whom is it acting on. For example, Jane admires her neighbor. So now we basically have to ask whom does Jane admire? So Jane admires her neighbor. So she basically admires her neighbor, which means that her neighbor is a direct object within the sentence. Charlie baked a cake. So now we need to ask ourselves, what did Charlie bake? And he baked a cake, which means that a cake is the direct object within the sentence. So also some verbs that have a direct object can also have an indirect object. So some verbs that have a direct object can also have an indirect object. And an indirect object is the pronoun, noun, or noun phrase that receives the direct object of the verb. So it is the pronoun, noun, or noun phrase that receives the direct object of a verb. And an indirect object, it always appears in between a verb and its direct object. So the indirect object, it always appears in between a verb and its direct object. And to find the indirect object in a sentence, we need to locate the action verb and its direct object and ask to what or to whom the direct object is being given. Or we can ask ourselves for what or for whom. So to what or to whom, or for what or for whom the action is being performed or the action is being given. The object is being given. For example, Charlie baked his mom a cake. Charlie baked his mom a cake. For whom did Charlie bake a cake? For his mom. So basically, for his mom is the indirect object within the sentence. So his mom would be the indirect object within the sentence. It's like you are saying for whom it is done. And remember that sometimes we need to be careful not to confuse an indirect object with an object of a preposition. An object of a preposition is a pronoun, noun, or noun phrase that comes directly after a preposition. Like it comes directly after to, for, in, under, or during. For example, Charlie baked a cake for his mom. So Charlie baked a cake for his mom. So basically, yeah, his mom is an object of a preposition, not an indirect object. Because yeah, his mom is after the preposition. And you can tell this because his mom comes directly after the preposition for, and because it does not appear in between the verb baked and the direct object cake. So basically, a direct object, right? It is the pronoun. It is a noun or noun phrase that receives the action. And we need to ask ourselves what or whom it is acting on. That is, if we want to find the direct object within a sentence, then we need to ask what is it acting on or whom is it acting on. And once again, I'll make an example of Jane admires her neighbor, right? So we need to ask ourselves, who does Jane admire? It's her neighbor. So which means that her neighbor is the direct object within the sentence. Jane admires her neighbor. Whom is she admiring? Her neighbor. So her neighbor being the direct object within that sentence. And what did Charlie bake? Charlie baked a cake. So you ask yourself, what did Charlie bake? And it was a cake. Means that a cake is the direct object within that sentence. And remember, some verbs that have a direct object can also have an indirect object, and that is why we have direct objects and we have indirect objects. And an indirect object is the pronoun, noun, or noun phrase that receives the direct object. So something that receives the direct object. And remember, we said a direct object is a pronoun, noun, or noun phrase that receives the action again of the verb. So which means that the indirect object is the pronoun, the noun, or the noun phrase that receives this direct object of a verb. It receives the action of a verb. And then again, the indirect object, it always appears in between a verb and its direct object. So once again, the indirect object always appears in between a verb and its direct object. And remember, when it comes to your indirect being object being in between the verb and the direct object, right? That is why sometimes if it is not in between the verb and the direct object, right, then you need to be careful that it is not after the preposition. Because if it's after the preposition, then it is basically a object of a preposition. Then it is not a indirect object. So your indirect object, right, it needs to appear between the verb and the direct object. And in order for us to locate this indirect object, right, we need to locate the action verb and the direct object and ask to what the direct object is being given, or to whom the direct object is being given, or for what the action is being performed, or for whom the action is being performed. And here we have an example. Charlie baked his mom a cake. So for whom did Charlie bake a cake? So Charlie baked his mom. So for his mom. And remember, yeah, they said that the indirect object needs to appear in between the verb as well as the indirect object. So like if again the sentence it says Charlie baked his mom a cake. So there's baked. There we have our indirect object. And whatever that's in between is his mom. So which means that for whom did Charlie bake his cake? For his mom. So Charlie baked his mom a cake. So his mom is the indirect object within the sentence. I remember we said that be careful that the indirect object is not after the preposition, because if it is, then it will be an object of a preposition. Because sometimes we can confuse an indirect object with an object of a preposition. Your indirect object needs to be between the verb and the direct object, not after the preposition. Because if it's after the preposition, then it means that it is an object of a preposition, not an indirect object. And the prepositions are to, for, in, under, or during. All right. At our favorite Italian restaurant, my father always orders us an extra cannoli for dessert. We need to say is this phrase in bold, a direct or an indirect object. So our favorite Italian restaurant, at our favorite Italian restaurant, my father always orders us an extra cannoli for dessert. Extra cannoli. We need to say if this is a direct or indirect object. Is it a direct or indirect object? All right, so if we look at the word extra cannoli, right? Remember, we need to ask ourselves when it comes to a direct or indirect object, then you need to ask yourself, what is it acting on or whom is it acting on, right? So basically, this is a direct object. So this is a direct object. Extra cannoli. It is the pronoun, noun, or noun phrase that receives the action of the verb. So which means that an extra cannoli is the direct object of the verb orders. It answers the question, what does my father always order for us for dessert? Extra cannoli. Direct object. We need to say if the phrase in bold is a direct object or an indirect object. Nina left the hotel staff a gracious thank you note. Nina left the hotel staff a gracious thank you note. Hotel staff. So we need to say if this is a direct or an indirect object. Nina left the hotel staff a gracious thank you note. Is it direct or indirect? And we see that a direct object, right, is the pronoun, noun, or noun phrase that receives the action of the verb. And an indirect object is the pronoun, noun, or noun phrase that receives the direct object of the noun and appears between the verb and the direct object. So we will then say hotel staff, right? It comes between also the verb as well as the direct object, right? So we will say this is an indirect object. So basically, hotel staff is an indirect object of the verb left, and it answers the question, for whom did Mina leave a gracious thank you note? For whom? And that was for the hotel staff. John's pediatrician prescribed him an antibiotics. John's pediatrician prescribed him an antibiotics. So him. We need to say if it is a direct object or an indirect object. So we need to basically ask for whom is that being given. So for whom is the antibiotics given, right? It is prescribed for him, which means that this is an indirect object. Indirect object. So it's an indirect object, right? And we had to say for whom it was prescribed or for whom the pediatrician prescribed the antibiotics. So you need to ask yourself for whom or to what or to whom to what, for what or for whom. So him is the indirect object of the verb prescribed and answers the question, for whom did John's pediatrician prescribe an antibiotic? So now we need to say if the phrase in bold is a direct object or if it is an indirect object. The cashier handed Grayson his credit card receipt. So we need to say if this is a direct object or an indirect object. The cashier handed Grayson his credit card receipt. So it's basically us asking what was handed to Grayson. What did the cashier hand Grayson? So this is a direct object. Because this is us asking what is or what did the cashier hand Grayson? So basically, the cashier handed Grayson his credit card receipt. So what did the cashier hand Grayson? It was his credit card receipt. The pie shop owner happily baked Farah a fresh blackberry pie for her birthday. So the pie shop owner happily baked Farah a fresh blackberry pie for her birthday party. For her party. We need to say if this is a direct or indirect object. So what did the pie shop owner bake Farah? We need to ask ourselves, what did the pie shop owner bake Farah? So fresh blackberry pie. That is what the pie owner baked Farah. So this is a direct object. So this is a direct object. And it's asking the question like what did the pie shop owner bake Farah? And fresh blackberry pie, that is what the owner baked her. Yes, what the owner happily baked Farah. Mindful of the hot sun, Jane offered her dog some water. Mindful of the hot sun, Jane offered her dog some water. We need to say if this is a direct or indirect object. It's basically us asking what did Jane offer her dog? So what did Jane offer her dog? So Jane offered the dog some water, which means that this is a direct object. This is a direct object. It basically answers that question. What did Jane offer her dog? All right, so basically we said we have direct objects and we have an indirect object, right? And when it comes to a direct object, when it comes to a direct object, and then we need to, a direct object is, it's the pronoun, the noun, or the noun phrase that receives the action of a verb. And in order for us to find the direct object within a sentence, we need to locate the action verb. And we can ask questions like, what is it acting on? Or whom is it acting on? So you can basically ask those questions, what or whom it is acting on. If it answers your question, then that is a direct object. And then we have an indirect object. So basically the same as a direct object. Some verbs that have the direct object, they can also have indirect objects. And an indirect object is the pronoun, is the noun or noun phrase that receives the direct object of a verb. It receives the direct object of the verb. And the indirect object, it always appears between the verb as well as its direct object. And in order for us to find the indirect object within a sentence, you need to locate the action verb. Locate the action verb. And then we also need to locate the direct object. So once we locate the action verb as well as the direct object, then we need to ask ourselves to what that the direct object is being given, or to whom the direct object is being given. Or you can also ask for what the action is being performed, or you can ask for whom the action is being performed. So that is basically a breakdown of direct objects and an indirect object, and the questions that you basically have to ask yourselves in order to locate or to get your answer. So with the direct object, you locate the action and ask what is it acting on or whom it is acting on. And with an indirect object, in order to locate the action verb of its direct object, you ask what or to whom the direct object is being given, or for what or for whom the action is being performed. All right, so now we're going to begin our test. So is the phrase in bold a direct object or an indirect object? Coach King threw her swim team an end of season party. Is that a direct object or an indirect object? So end of season party. So we can basically ask ourselves, what did Coach King throw her swim team? So she threw her team an end of season party. Then we can say it's a direct object because it answers what. Camille built her clients a sleek new website. Camila built her clients a sleek new website. So Camille built her clients a sleek new website. So it's like us asking, what did Camila build her clients? She built the clients a sleek new website. So which means that we can say this is a direct object. So that is a direct object. Wendy owes Maki $20 for last night's dinner. So Wendy owes Maki $20 for last night's dinner. We need to say if this is a direct object or an indirect object. And if we look at the sentence, right, remember we said the word the direct object, it appears between the verb as well as the direct object. So we can say this is an indirect object. Harry caught us a huge fish for lunch. Harry caught us a huge fish for lunch. Harry caught us a huge fish for lunch. So we need to say if this is a direct object or if it is an indirect object. So basically, we're asking ourselves, what did Harry catch us for lunch? He caught us a huge catfish for lunch. Let's say it's a direct, I think it's a direct object. The pie shop owner happily baked Farah a fresh blackberry pie for her party. So it's like us asking, what did the pie shop owner happily bake Farah? And the pie shop owner happily baked Farah a freshly baked blueberry pie. So fresh blueberry or blackberry pie. So that is a direct object. Connor prepared his family a delicious herb roasted chicken for dinner. So Connor prepared his family a delicious herb roasted chicken for dinner. We need to say if this is a direct object or an indirect object. So, what did Connor prepare his family for dinner? A delicious herb roasted chicken. So, we can say this is a direct object. At our favorite Italian restaurant, my father always orders us an extra cannoli for dessert. We need to say if this is a direct object or an indirect object. So, what dessert does her father always order them or her? It's an extra cannoli for dessert. Then we can say this is a direct object. All right, so basically, that is now the end of our lesson on direct and indirect object. And remember, we said with a direct object, right? It is it's you basically have to ask questions like to whom or to what extent, what is it being asked, right? um, what is it acting on, whom is it acting on? That is for a direct object, right? And for an indirect object, we can ask ourselves questions like to what or to whom the direct object is being given, or for what or for whom the action is being performed, right? So that is a direct object and an indirect object. So that is now the end of our lesson, grade 8, on direct and indirect object. Thank you very much for joining our class, and you should have a good evening further. Goodbye.